In the year 396 BC, the Romans besieged the Etruscan city of Veii. The city's deity, Juno Regina, was besieged with a promise of greater rewards in Rome, amidst an arcane ritual performed by Roman priests. After successfully capturing the city, her sacred objects, attendant Etruscan priests, and cult statues were removed, finding habitation in a new temple on the Aventine. In the year 241 BC, the city of Falerii in Italy was besieged and taken, and the cults of Janus and Minerva were likewise transported to Rome. In 204 BC, the cult of Cybele was transferred from Anatolia to Rome. Her sky stone, statue, and serving priests and priestesses occupied a new residence in the Temple of Victory. Here the Senate and Roman pontiffs could keep secure watch over the foreign priests and control their revenues. During the Second Punic War, the Carthaginian goddess Tanit was appealed to and claimed. She became another aspect of Juno, Juno Celestis, translated as Heavenly Juno. In 195 BC, Hannibal Barca fled to the east and pledged himself to aid any eastern ruler who might prove capable of stopping the indomitable rise of Rome. By now all rulers and priesthoods knew that their domains were coming under imminent threat. A great new power had risen, a power not even their gods could withstand. Hannibal Barca naturally found his way to the most powerful ruler in Asia Minor, the Seleucid king Antiochus III. 4 years later, Antiochus moved to challenge Rome's spreading influence in Greece. His gigantic and elaborately equipped army was subsequently overwhelmed. Rome had cultivated many allies in the region after aiding Greece previously with a liberation from Macedonian rule, and together they bested Antiochus, chasing him back into Asia. Rome was not yet quite ready then to move into Asia, but she was beginning to sniff around the perimeter, interfering in the politics of the region. Gradually the Seleucids, presently weakened, fell apart. The Macedonians were next to stand and attempt to curb Rome's growing influence. They were likewise checked and vanquished. Soon thereafter, while bristling under Roman hegemony, a futile Greek rebellion was raised, subsequently crushed, and thereupon the whole region was subsumed as a Roman province. Before long, well over 80 divinities began to crowd Rome, watched over guardedly by the resolute supremacy of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Consequently, the strategy of evocatio gradually diminished, becoming replaced by a new program, interpretatio Romana, that is, the associating of foreign gods with their Roman equivalents, to create a smoother transition for foreigners to accustom themselves to Roman rule. Evocatio, however, had only been used during sieges, and only on occasion. Most gods had arrived to Rome willingly, their priests desirous of placing outposts at the newly emerging hub of the financial world. The first whispers of subversion were laid upon the Etruscan priests, labeled deceitful and untrustworthy, oft accused of attempting tricks to benefit their own people. One example can be witnessed in an old tale, wherein the wisest priest of Etruria was consulted about the discovery of a head on the Capitoline Hill. Recognizing that the omen presaged that the spot where the head was found would be the head of the world, caput rerum, the priest attempted to capture it by suggesting to the Roman ambassadors that they needed to reveal the location where the head was found before he could read the omen properly. The Roman ambassadors recognized that the priest was trying to get them to say that the omen was found here, i.e., in Etruria. But they persisted in stating that the omen was found in Rome, and so kept the omen for the Romans. The Roman Senate kept very close watch over the Etruscan priests, the so-named haruspices employed to gain Rome divine favor, but the cults of Greek origin brought to Rome amidst many acts of diplomacy and integration were allotted far more agency. In 184 BC, a Greek cult of Dionysus was suppressed and brought under senatorial control after it was discovered to have been operating a sort of mafioso operation. Under the cover of religion, priests and acolytes were infiltrating the state, breaking civil, moral, and religious laws with impunity. Weak-minded individuals were persuaded to commit ritualistic or political murders undetected, at the behest of those who secretly controlled the cult. Right in the heart of Rome, the Roman historian Livy claims that the cult held a particular appeal to those of uneducated and fickle mind, levitas animi, including the young, plebeians, women, and, most notably, men most like women. A modern accord might be detected in these accusations. Dionysus is a god of foreign origin in Greek mythology. He undertook efforts to introduce his religion into Greece, but was opposed by rulers who feared it, on account of the disorders and madness it brought with it. Using tricks and curses, Dionysus brought down the rulers who opposed him. In the Iliad, when King Lycurgus of Thrace heard that Dionysus was in his kingdom, he imprisoned Dionysus' followers, the Maenads. Dionysus fled and took refuge with Thetis, then sent a drought which stirred the people to revolt. The god then drove King Lycurgus insane, and had him slice his own son into pieces with an axe in the belief that he was a patch of ivy, a plant holy to Dionysus. An oracle then claimed that the land would stay dry and barren as long as Lycurgus lived. The people rebelled, and the king was drawn and quartered. Appeased by the king's death, Dionysus lifted the curse. According to Diodorus Siculus, the ancient cult of Dionysus conquered the whole world except for Britain and Ethiopia. As Dionysus Eleutherios, that is, the liberator, his wine, music, and ecstatic dance free his followers from self-conscious fear and care, and subvert the oppressive restraints of the powerful. In the Greek pantheon, Dionysus, along with Zeus, absorbs the role of Sabazios, a Thracian or Phrygian deity. In the Roman pantheon, Sabazios became an alternative name for Bacchus, which is the Roman name for Dionysus. However, there is confusion. Livy records that the Bacchic mysteries were a novelty at Rome. Originally restricted to women and held only 3 times a year, they were corrupted by an Etruscan Greek version, the Dionysian cult, which was eventually suppressed. The historian Diodorus Siculus said that, according to some writers of myths, there were 2 gods named Dionysus, an older one, who was the son of Zeus and Persephone, but that the younger one also inherited the deeds of the older, and so the men of later times, being unaware of the truth and being deceived because of the identity of their names, thought there had been but one Dionysus. Dionysus was a suffering god who became a conquering god. Just as in Jewish mythology, there is a suffering Messiah who becomes a vengeful Messiah. In Christianity, the first and second comings of Christ, Dionysus' suffering was the distinctive feature of the cult, just as Christ's suffering is. In 139 BC, the Jews were expelled from Rome for propagating the corrupting cult of Jupiter Sabazios, that is, Jupiter Dionysus, or another cult of Dionysus under a new name. Several ancient sources record an apparently widespread belief in the classical world that the god worshipped by the Jewish people, Yahweh, was identifiable as Dionysus via his identification with Sabazios. According to Plutarch, one of the reasons for the identification is that Jews were reported to hail their god with a cry typically associated with the worship of Sabazios. Coins used by the Jewish Maccabees included imagery linked to the worship of Dionysus, such as grapes, vine leaves, and cups. A coin dated to 55 BC depicts a kneeling king labeled Bacchus Judaeus. In the 2nd century BC, Jews would also write the Sibylline oracles, a purposeful imitation of the famous Sibylline books that the Roman religion was centered around, mirroring their form and attributing them to the Sibyls in order through confusion to diffuse Jewish ideologies, doctrines, and prophecies. Jewish and later Christian authors continued to compose and redact existing oracles in this manner until the 2nd century of the current era. Therein they praised God, denounced idolatry, and predicted the universal tyranny of Rome. They predicted the coming of a Jewish messianic figure who would be given rulership over the scepters of the earth, who would utterly decimate Rome in retribution for her sins, and, most importantly, or realistically, would return wealth to those whom Rome had stolen it from. Rome, after taking a province, would use usury to entrap kingdoms and force them to mortgage off their public buildings until they all came under Roman control, similar to modern debt traps used today. As we will later see, Christianity took the banking monopoly away from Rome and gave it to the Jews. The Jews were not the only ones working on religious prophecies to destroy the advent of Rome. Around the same period emerged the Oracle of Hystaspes, produced by a Persian Babylonian sage. This oracle foretold the destruction of Rome by fire and sword, and the coming of a Savior King from the East, whose birth would be proclaimed by a brilliant light from heaven. An older and very similar prophecy, the Zoroastrian apocalyptic scripture of the 3rd century BC, called the Bamanyasht, envisioned an avenging Savior Prince who would be born under a shooting star and would drive foreign tyrants out of Asia. In 135 BC, a comet coincided with the birth of a young prince of Pontus named Mithridates VI. When he was but a baby, lightning struck his cradle, leaving a distinctive scar shaped like a crown on his forehead. Some said the lightning strike inspired his nickname, Dionysus. Dionysus had similarly been marked for greatness by Zeus's divine lightning while still in the womb. Mithridates used this name in his propaganda and placed Dionysus's image on his coins, an immediately recognizable symbol of opposition to Rome. Slave rebellions like Spartacus's would likewise proclaim the name of Dionysus and even seek aid from Mithridates. Spartacus's wife was, in fact, a priestess of Dionysus. Mithridates, whose name means sent by Mithra, the sun god of the Zoroastrian religion, was also always accompanied by a group of Scythian shamans whose teachings predated Zoroastrianism. The Inarei, as they were called, were Scythian androgynous or effeminate priests and shamanistic soothsayers who played an important role in the Scythian religion. Recall Livy's statement about the subversive cult of Bacchus, or Dionysus, appealing to men most like women. During the 7th century BC, the Scythians expanded into West Asia, during which time the Scythian religion was influenced by the religions of the peoples of the Fertile Crescent. The Scythians believed that the androgyny of the Inarei originated during this period from a curse by the goddess Artempasa to the perpetrators of the sack of the temple in Ascalon of the goddess Astarte, who was herself an androgynous vegetation fertility goddess, who was believed to have the ability to change men into women and women into men, and whom the Scythians identified with their own goddess Artempasa. This curse was hereditary and was inherited by the descendants of the perpetrators of the sack. The transvestite androgyny of the Inaria was thus also typical of the cult of the Levantine celestial Astarte. Here we perceive a more ancient subversion of the ancient Aryan, or Indo-European, religion, of which Rome was a remaining leg of, and something which will require another video to delve further into. The Scythians were always said in ancient times to have once been a great and powerful people who degenerated. The subversion of their dominant hypermasculine values via religion has parallels in the ideological warfare used against Rome, and even against the colonialist empires of our modern day. Mithridates, the foretold savior prince, would proceed to spend his life conspiring against and waging war on Rome, propagandizing his battle in Zoroastrian terms as one of light versus the darkness, a theme the Jews would similarly adopt. In this period, the Roman Senate began to lose some of its control. Generals like Marius and Sylla took more and more power as the empire's borders stretched. In 104 BC, seers in Rome reported that weapons in the sky had suddenly rushed together from east and west, and those from the east overcame those of the west. During a diplomatic meeting with Marius, Mithridates may have conversed in Aramaic about these omens with Marius's Syrian prophetess, Martha. She had been discovered at the gladiatorial games in Rome, accurately predicting which men would be victors. Now Marius claimed that he followed Martha's advice in all undertakings. She accompanied him everywhere, carried in a fancy litter by tall slaves from her own native Syria, dressed in a crimson robe fastened with a golden brooch and waving a little spear decorated with ribbons. Martha directed Marius's theatrical religious sacrifices. Sylla was likewise a target for foreign priests. A servant of the Anatolian goddess Mabellona delivered a prophecy to Sylla during his civil war against Marius, saying that the gods had promised him victory over his enemies, but also informed him that if he did not return to Rome as soon as possible, the capital would be engulfed in flames. Sylla did not return. The capital was subsequently burned, destroying both the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus and the precious Sibylline books. The temple would be rebuilt, and more books would be procured from the Sibyls, the ancient prophetesses of the Neolithic mother goddess. but Rome's attachment to its ancient religion would decline thenceforward. Deceived by this act of arson, Sulla pledged himself to Mabellona. In 88 BC, Mithridates and much of Asia Minor planned and carried out a total massacre of all Italian residents in their region. Upwards of 80,000 innocents were slaughtered. The deplorable acts carried out by Anatolians, Greeks, Jews, Syrians, and others. Mithridates then proceeded to lead a massive force to take Greece. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Sulla met and crushed Mithridates in 2 decisive battles, and the great hope of the East was diminished and eventually finished. Rome's martial power was too supreme. Sulla wasted little respect on the temples in Greece during his campaign, taking the treasures at Delphi and Delos for himself, destroying the Platonic Academy, and ransacking countless temples. Athenian of Athens complained, quote, "The Roman Senate controls our government. The Romans have closed our temples and let our schools fall to dust. Our theaters are off limits, and our courts of justice and schools of philosophy are silenced. They have even taken the Nix, our sacred place of assembly, away from the people." End quote. After this speech, the Greek crowd rushed to the theater of Dionysus and elected Athenian general of the citizen army. It was subsequently put down. The hopes of the East evaporated at this point. The Roman general Pompey would quickly march down the Levantine coast, subduing as far as Judea and the Nabatean Arabs. Only Egypt had avoided the sight of Roman legions. In 59 BC, due to a fear that the Roman people were abandoning the Senate-controlled gods, the Egyptian gods Isis, Harpocrates, and Anubis, who had placed outposts of their worship in Rome, were banned from the capital, their altars destroyed. A popular outcry arose in response. The cult of Isis was one which appealed to and manipulated the lower classes, much like that of Dionysus. Clearly, the Egyptian priests, ancient adepts of subterfuge, had managed to slither obscured amongst the dense throng at Rome, quietly adding pawns to their ranks. Eventually, after Augustus conquered Egypt and had secured the region, the Flavians allowed the cult to return under a more watchful eye. Many Jews knew by this time that a military victory was unforeseeable. If they were going to fulfill their biblical hopes, not only for world dominance but for mere survival, they needed a new strategy. Adapting the infiltration tactics which had shown some initial promise, they changed their scripture, and a new script was written. Romans 15:12 of their new script would read, quote, "There shall be a root of Jesse, that is, from the line of King David, and he that shall rise to reign over the Gentiles, non-Jews. In him shall the Gentiles trust." As the Roman juggernaut tightened its grip upon Judea, the first aspect of the Jewish Messiah, the suffering Messiah, who was, like Mithridates, born under a prophetic light in the sky, was sent to the Romans as a sacrifice. The Jew Peter would lead the task of infiltrating Rome with this new cult, while Paul focused on tricking the non-Jews into adopting the religion. Galatians 2:7-9 reads, "On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me in sending me to the Gentiles." And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. The cult saw an initial rise due to the Jewish diaspora and the slaves who were taken to Rome, but it remained immature and tainted with Jewish fanaticism. A common theme among the Eastern mystery religions present at the time in Rome, stemming from a more ancient theological war, was a disillusionment with material possessions, a focus on death, and a preoccupation with regards to the afterlife. To the non-Jews, the Jewish Christians preached this suicidal denial of the world, in one form to the commoners, in another form to the literate classes under a branch we today call Gnosticism, a corruption of Plato's concept of the demiurge. But as for the Jewish Christians, who were still well versed in Judaism, they continued to bristle under Roman rule and set about upon acts of sabotage, the most famous whereof was the Great Fire in Rome. Emperor Nero arrested and burned them in response. Due to this impatience, the cult would remain mostly underground, but over time it would evolve and learn to present itself as a timid mouse, a threat to no one. Rome now had little need to negotiate with foreign priests. Augustus centralized the Roman religion by making himself the father of the empire, the divinely sanctioned chief priest of a new cult, blessed by Jupiter. Those who resisted and did not accept the imperial cult or associate their gods with Rome's were exterminated. The Druids were wiped out. The Jews not in on the plot of infiltration wasted their time with futile rebellions, emulating Mithridates to conduct wholesale massacres of Romans out of fanatical frustration. They were in turn reduced to numerical insignificance. Some would escape by fleeing further east, out of Rome's reach, wherefrom they would hatch further plots. Some people speculate that Christianity may have been the Emperor Vespasian's attempt to bring Judaism under imperial control. If so, the Jews were prepared and laid traps within their new script. Judaism itself was too alien and intolerant to be integrated into any aspect of the Roman religion. The Romans instead created a special tax targeting Jews, directing their revenues which once flowed into the Temple of Jerusalem into the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Circumcision was used to rout out crypto-Jews who refused to pay the tax. Uncircumcised Christians were deemed wayward apostates who had to be reformed, and so had to prove their loyalty through sacrifice to the imperial cult. Christianity was too small to be overly concerned with at the time, with innumerable other cults dotting a huge land spread. Trajan would end up employing a policy of executing any Christian criminal brought to trial due to their untrustworthiness, but otherwise not to bother routing them out. Tiny churches that popped up paid their taxes, rendered unto Caesar what was Caesar's, opened their worship to all, and remained relatively passive. Thus, so long as they did not appear to be conspiring, there appeared little need for the state to crack down on them. Christian intellectuals would consistently assure critics and officials that they posed no threat to the social order. They had learned how to play mouse while preparing one day to become the cat. Around the same time, the cult of Mithraism would appear, seemingly a similar infiltration tactic employed by the Zoroastrians, and indeed Christians would accuse Mithraists of copying their rituals and ideas. Mithraism, however, far outstripped Christianity in early popularity, possibly because it did not engage in acts of wild fanaticism, while appearing to behave like an insidious Masonic organization, engaging in secrecy and attracting merchants and customs officials. Mithraism never appeared to be hostile to the state. By the year 148, the Emperor Antoninus Pius was already patronizing the cult, and Commodus and perhaps Marcus Aurelius would be initiates. The cult attracted significant power over soldiers, yet wars against Zoroastrian Parthian never ceased, amounting to mostly Roman victories. Either the cult was set up by priests only concerned with personal power and enriching themselves, as most were, or the state managed to gain control of it early on, as the emperor's patronage suggests. There are many indications of its relations to the ancient Roman cult of Sol, and it appears most definitely to later become integrated with the cult to become Sol Invictus. As countless priests and cults vied for power at the heart of the world, it would require more than a century before one cult finally managed a great co-op in ascension to power. Septimius Severus, the first emperor to be not of Italian origin, was born to a Carthaginian father who had through wealth managed connections that allowed his son to rise through the ranks in Rome. After the assassination of the Emperor Pertinax, Severus marched his legions to Rome and claimed the throne. Severus would proceed to execute senators and fill their ranks with his cousins and friends, likewise replacing the Praetorian Guard with his own troops. He would honor his fellow Carthaginian Hannibal Barca, the ancient enemy of Rome, with a marble tomb. Famous historian Edward Gibbon maligned him by saying, quote, "Posterity, who experienced the fatal effects of his maxims and example, justly considered him as the principal author of the decline of the Roman Empire." End quote. Much of this was because Severus severely debased the currency. Dionysus was a patron deity and founding hero at Leptis Magna, the birthplace of the Emperor Septimius Severus. who promoted his cult. In addition to this, Severus would marry Juliadana from the Arab or Phoenician Emessene dynasty, daughter to a very wealthy high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal. Julia would wield great influence over Severus, as well as the successive emperor, their son Caracalla. Caracalla would proceed to leave the administration of the empire to his mother. Under her guidance, one of the greatest obstacles to subversion was removed. Roman citizenship was extended to all free men living in the empire. Caracalla would further debase the currency, causing inflation, grant favors to the Emessene nobles, and greatly advance the Egyptian cult of Serapis, who is associated with Dionysus. Caracalla would be assassinated by his praetorian prefect, a Bourbon named Macrinus. Despite being another foreigner, Macrinus claimed the title of emperor and appeared to have no ill intent, attempting to restore value to the currency and killing the insidious foreigner Juliadamna. Julia's sister, Julia Misa, fled back to Emesa with an immense fortune pilfered from Rome. Her grandson, Elagabalus, was named chief priest of Elagabal, and with their wealth they funded a rebellion, managing to kill Macrinus and reclaim the title of emperor. Elagabalus, now emperor, then replaced Jupiter as Rome's chief deity with Elagabal, well before Jesus would claim a similar victory. Carthage had been defeated 350 years ago, yet now their god Baal, of which Elagabal was the Emessene manifestation, reigned supreme in Rome, just as the Jews would one day likewise tout their god's supremacy over Rome. Elagabalus, notorious for being a man who acts like a woman, would further debase the currency, dishonor Rome's Vestal virgins, and strangely, have himself circumcised and abstain from swine. An ancient Emessene ruler 2 centuries before Elagabalus was likewise circumcised when he married a Jewish Herodian princess, although they did not produce children. Later, in the year 354, there would be a troop in the Roman army called the Regi Emesseni Judae, that is, the Royal Emessene Jews. During Elagabalus's reign, the most sacred relics from the Roman religion were transferred from their respective shrines to the Elagabalium, including the emblem of the Great Mother, the fire of Vesta, the shields of the Sali, and the Palladium, so that no other god could be worshipped except in association with Elagabal. It was too much too soon. Discontent grew from every corner until the emperor was assassinated and all his religious edicts reversed. Julia Misa then placed her other grandson on the throne, Severus Alexander. He would attempt to appease public outrage by ruling more moderately. After failing to install Elagabal, they pivoted their strategy and joined with the more subtle, growing cult of Christianity, a cult whose mysteries they were introduced to through their connections to Jewish elites. Origen, one of the fathers of the Christian Church, began to tutor Severus Alexander, and the new emperor would proceed to build a synagogue in Rome and desired to build a temple to Jesus, but was dissuaded by Roman senators. But he could not escape the public outrage Elagabalus had aroused. Eventually, tired of the effeminate, greedy foreign priest class, Rome's military men assassinated him and took the empire for themselves. Several of these soldier emperors would recognize the growing influence Christians were having and would persecute its top members, but the age became so chaotic that their actions would never remain persistent. Hyperinflation instituted by the Severans bankrupted the empire. Under the Severans, Rome's coinage would go from 81% purity to 50% purity, and then plunge to 4% purity not long after. Oddly, there is also an arch that was dedicated by the money changers to Septimius Severus, called the Arch of the Money Changers. Civil wars, perhaps funded by nefarious players, now tore the empire apart. The Roman bankers disappeared from the historical record. Currency became worthless, and only those who held silver and other assets could wield financial influence. In this period, the churches magically became quite wealthy, while everyone else grew impoverished. Christians, or Jews, were quite familiar with monetary practices. One of the early popes was a banker, Callistus, who became pope in the year 217, received a large sum of money from his owner, an imperial freedman named Carpophorus, with the instruction to bring him profits from banking deals. Callistus's bank was apparently located in a region of Rome called Piscina Publica. Callistus would later be arrested for fighting in a synagogue when he tried to borrow money or collect debts from some Jews. Or perhaps he was Jewish, and that was where he made his deals. Using this newfound wealth, the Christians would not only bribe their way into higher positions, but they would set up charities to curry influence over the masses. Christianity, however, was not the Jews' only strategy. Seeing that their tactic was beginning to yield fruit, they employed a similar strategy in the neighboring Sassanid Empire. A Jew named Mani, who had already infiltrated the high ranks of Parthian nobility, employed another Gnostic branch of Judaism melded with Zoroastrian elements, which would become known as Manichaeism. Jews consider non-Jews to be of Satan, and believe that they can trick Satan through deception. Thus, in both Christianity and Manichaeism, the teachings are cloaked in a language that supports the Jews' perception of evil. By following these cults, the adherents prove their wickedness, and as Satan is the accuser of the Jews, these cults, as controlled opposition, accuse the Jews as being of evil, yet render themselves impotent to do anything about it. The Jewish strategy is to acquire the wealth of the world. The cults it creates for the non-Jews declares money and materialism as something to be avoided, the world as something to be abandoned, in exchange for a made-up world after death. The Jews' Persian golems would eventually begin entering and infiltrating Rome. In the year 272, a powerful Eastern family, which had been favored by the Severans, would break away from the Roman Empire to create the Palmyrene Empire, its center of control being Palmyra and Emesa, wherefrom the Severan Emesene priests had originated. Christians, Jews and Manichaeans all held significant influence in the new Palmyrene Empire. Many Christian authors would claim that its queen Zenobia was in fact Jewish. She was likely related to the Emesene dynasty via Julia Urania, an Emesene princess who had married into the Mauritanian line. They would raise an army of 70,000 men, but Emperor Aurelian would defeat them and quickly recapture the breakaway state. In the year 274, Aurelian would raise the cult of Sol Invictus to the position of official divinity of the Roman Pantheon, standing beside the storm god Jupiter at the head, hesitantly outranking him in some manners, yielding to him in others. This reform would not garner the lashback that Elagabalis's reform did. It was not a clear attempt of foreign infiltration, but a raising of the Senate-controlled cult of Sol in combination with the secretive cult of Mithraism, which had become significant during an era of soldier emperors. The imperial cult, while continuing to be maintained, had lost much of its effect after so many sudden regime changes, many of whom struggled to trace their lineage back to any one of renown. Aurelian's ancestors were priests of Sol, and so through Sol he would derive his claim to divine approval. Aurelian would then have to engage in a brief war against the mint workers, stamping out the corruptors who had debased the currency and almost destroyed the empire. Diocletian would rise to the throne in 284, and set to work hunting out the new Manichaean infiltration. He spoke of them thusly: "We have heard that the Manichaeans have set up new and hitherto unheard of sects in opposition to the older creeds so that they might cast out the doctrines vouchsafed to us in the past by the divine favor, for the benefit of their own depraved doctrine. They have sprung forth very recently like new and unexpected monstrosities among the race of the Persians, a nation still hostile to us, and have made their way into our empire, where they are committing many outrages, disturbing the tranquility of our people, and even inflicting grave damage to the civic communities. We have cause to fear that with the passage of time they will endeavor, as usually happens, to infect the modest and tranquil of an innocent nature with the damnable customs and perverse laws of the Persians as with the poison of a malignant serpent. We order that the authors and leaders of these sects be subjected to severe punishment, and, together with their abominable writings, burnt in the flames. We direct their followers, if they continue recalcitrant, shall suffer capital punishment, and their goods be forfeited to the imperial treasury. And if those who have gone over to that hitherto unheard of, scandalous and wholly infamous creed, or to that of the Persians, are persons who hold public office, or are of any rank or of superior social status. You will see to it that their estates are confiscated and the offenders sent to the quarry at Phino or the mines at Proconnesus. And in order that this plague of iniquity shall be completely extirpated from this our most happy age, let your devotion hasten to carry out our orders and commands." End quote. As for the Christians, he purged them from his legions. Then he went after their properties and treasures, arresting every member of the clergy. Prisons became overfilled. The only demand, however, that he made of these men was to make a sacrifice to the Roman gods to prove their loyalty. Many did so, then simply went on as before, although it did cause some fracturing in the Christian ranks between martyrs and traitors. But the numbers of Christians had grown too large. By demonstrating wealth and power when the empire was fractured and impoverished, they had gathered in an enormous increase in numbers, and by taking advantage of the empire's disaccount to grow unchallenged, they had escaped any real opportunity to put them down. Now Diocletian was forced to take half measures, consistently weighing up the severity of the measures with the public response and dissension it might create. As a restorer, his goal was to avoid the discord of the previous decades, not render new ones, and so he treaded too lightly. Constantius and his son took advantage of the persecutions to gain the support of Christians. Constantine would make great promises to the Christians in exchange for their money to help win his civil war following Diocletian's reign. After his victory, he repaid his debts, legalized the Christian religion, patronized the Christians with much wealth, restored the property taken from them, and promoted Christians to high-ranking offices. Most influential people in the empire, however, especially high military officials, remained non-Christian. 2/3 of Constantine's top government remained non-Christian. Constantine would continue to attempt a balance of acknowledgement of the currently established Sol Invictus as well as the Roman Pantheon, while favoring the Christian religion. In an attempt to stifle discord, he would build a brand new city where no existing pagan temples dwelt, and where from the emperor could integrate the new religion without offending the old gods or inciting the intolerance of the new. It was a delicate balance that could never last. Constantine tipped that balance firmly in favor of Christianity during his last years. Sacred temple funds would be taken from pagans and used to adorn his new eponymous capital city. Christian bishops knew well how to feed his narcissism, and he well knew how he came to power and how he might lose his grip on it. Bereft of funds, pagan festivals would wither and die while Christian ceremonies became ever more lavish and spectacular. Christianity would continue to profit from division as Constantine's sons warred after their father's death. Constans would ban pagan sacrifices in 341 after defeating his brother in 340, possibly a promise made for support. A general named Magnentius would kill Constans and rescind the ban to gain the support of wealthy pagans in Rome. Another of Constantine's sons would defeat him in battle, Constantius II, who would then proceed to prescribe the death penalty for anyone who made pagan sacrifices or worshipped idols. He would also shut down many pagan temples and removed the altar of victory from the Senate. Emboldened Christian mobs began destroying, pillaging and desecrating temples, monuments, and tombs. The cat had now revealed its claws. Most legal persecutions of pagans were ignored by governors and magistrates at this time, and Constantius never pushed them to proceed, nor did he disband the senatorial priestly colleges or the schools or the Vestal Virgins. He was fulfilling a promise but struggling to appease both factions, favoring the most powerful but wary of the other. His cousin Julian would become emperor next, an intellectual pagan who maintained power through his Germanic army, as yet not under Christian influence. He would appeal to the hold that Mithraism still held among the soldiers, return state funds to the upkeep of pagan temples, make laws targeting wealthy Christians including those who had infiltrated government roles, repeal the stipends awarded to Christian bishops, restore the Arch of Victory in the Senate, and took control of the schools to ensure that only pagan teachers were employed. He exposed the way which Christian charity was used to outcompete paganism in a letter to a pagan high priest. Quote, "It is disgraceful that, when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Christians support not only their own pua but ours as well. All men see that our people lack aid from us. Teach those of the Hellenic faith to contribute to public service of this sort, and the Hellenic villages to offer their first fruits to the gods, and accustom those who love the Hellenic religion to these good works by teaching them that this was our practice of old. Julian would flirt with the idea of centralizing paganism from scattered temples dedicated to individual gods to a system where all revenues and power could be pooled in one place, in effect to combat the centralization of Christianity. But it would never come to be. Meanwhile, sensing an opportune moment as their strategy played out to fruition, the Jews encouraged Julian to allow and help them build the third temple, feigning to be a counterbalance that would somewhat help to legitimize Christianity. Herefrom the Jews could become the banking masters of the world, filling the hole of lending that Christianity, due to its purposeful law against lending at interest to each other, would leave, thus fulfilling the Jewish prophecy in Deuteronomy 15:6, "For the Lord your God will bless you just as he promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you." End quote. Christianity would take over the world, and all the world's wealth would fall into the hands of the Jews, just as they had used the control of wealth to enable Christianity to take over Rome. They would likewise take over the world when the time was ripe. Such was their hopes. As per their mythology, Esau, whom they used as a code word to refer to Rome, came out of the womb first, while Jacob lashed onto his heel and was carried along. Through deceit, Jacob would eventually steal Esau's kingdom. The Jews would likewise plan to steal the kingdom of the world after Christianity had conquered it. Such was their ambitions. Such has it played out. But the third temple was not to be at that time. Julian would die on campaign after only 3 years of his reign. He would be followed by 2 military commanders as emperors, Jovian and Valentinian. Yet both would repeal Julian's privileges to pagans, oust his appointees, and restore Christian privileges. In the year 380, Christianity would be legalized as the official state religion, with all pagan temples and shrines ordered to give all their property and revenues to the treasury. By aligning with Christianity, the state had centralized religion, but with the consequence that the script had been written by Jews and contained traps within. Nor did the emperors maintain much control over the church. In 390, a bishop named Ambrose wrote Emperor Theodosius a letter stating that the emperor needed to demonstrate repentance for a massacre after a public riot, further adding that Emperor Theodosius would be forbidden from receiving the Eucharist until he had done so. Theodosius submitted, demonstrating the power the church held over the people, able to incite them into perpetual rebellion if the emperor did not obey the church. Exploiting this control of both the people and the emperor, bishops and monks would incite their hordes to attack and tear down countless pagan temples. Christian mobs were above the law, while pagans who attempted to enact revenge would face the death penalty. Roman society became torn, while Christian divisions over petty scriptural interpretations ripped it to shreds. Priests of one denomination would open the gates to Greece for gods of their denomination to attack Romans of another denomination. Allegiance to religion overcame allegiance to the state. The emperors continued to attempt to balance the religions to maintain some stability in the fracturing empire. Pagans still wielded influence in the Senate and elsewhere. In 391, both consuls were pagans. They would be the last. In 392, a pagan revitalization movement would begin in the Western Empire and take power under Eugenius and Arbogast. Theodosius took his eastern forces to meet them in battle and lost, yet overnight would bribe many of the Western forces to join him and so turn the tide the next day. Once again, the higher concentration of wealth proved victorious for Christianity. Mithraism was subsequently targeted so that its influence over soldiers, the final cultic threat to Christianity, was extinguished. Now, with each successive generation, there was less and less reason for people to align themselves with paganism over Christianity. Some suspected pagan ambitions persisted among high-ranking senators and even emperors in the West. Yet the Western Roman Empire would become consumed by invasions, eventually fracturing and falling. In the Eastern Empire, practicing pagan rites was punishable by death by the year 451. The Christians had won. The empire was no more. Jupiter had fallen, as had Sol Invictus. A new world order had begun. If you enjoyed this documentary, check out my classical fantasy series on Amazon, The Spirit and the Serpent.